I feel that the best way to start self-employment well is to go into freelancing with the mindset that you are going to do this as a business. That way you set your pricing up, figure all of this stuff out ahead of time, because there's nothing worse than starting out as a freelancer charging $50 an hour, and then you start wanting to move up to full-time self-employment and you realize I can't do that with $50 an episode clients. I just don't have enough time in the week to take
Right.
on enough clients to live. So trying to go from $50 an episode to maybe $200 an episode, like you were saying, it's a challenge trying to find those clients. And
Yeah.
especially if you're not already established as a podcast editor with a really solid roster. So
Yeah.
it does take time, and running a business is it's its own thing. Having being a killer podcast editor is only part of what's required to be a podcast editor business. There's
Right.
all the business skills to come in to play that a lot of us don't know. So there's a lot of learning as we go.
I think when I started out doing this, I felt very isolated as a person who was trying to um, build a podcast editing business while I was also working full time. Um, and I think kind of building that community takes some tenacity of people who are building a business while they have right like their day job. Um, because that is another attitude, at least that I encountered, was uh, oh, well, you're just doing this on the side. I don't actually have to pay you that much. Not that I think it's a battle, but I would almost argue that you should pay somebody more if they're sacrificing their evenings and weekends to work on your show. But there's a little bit of that too, right? Like and I'm always very upfront with clients. This is when I'll be working on your show. If you send me an email at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm just going to let you know, maybe I can't answer your email. And if you have a question or you need an update, but also I might be talking to somebody about their financial aid. And it might be right 7 p.m. for me before your email gets answered. And I want you to know that that is the case. Um, so you kind of have to play with that too, right? If you're not a person who can just quit what's paying the bills while you build your business.
Exactly. And I want to go back to what you were talking about feeling isolated. And that's one of the reasons that I started working on the community that I'm building right now, is because even though there are a lot of different groups out there in social media, they can be helpful, but they can also be kind of judgmental in a lot of ways,
Oh,
not
yeah.
really welcoming, especially when you see people posting innocent questions anonymously because they worry about being judged or ridiculed. And that doesn't help. But also, I think the other reason I was wanting to start this community is we we do oftentimes work in a silo, whether it's in terms
Yeah.
of the audio work, in terms of running a business. People will share some information, but too many people want to keep some stuff to themselves because they don't want to give the competition an edge up. And to
Right.
me, I'm all about sharing information. If we have information to share with others, I want to help share that. If I can help somebody avoid making a mistake that I've made in the past, I want to help them avoid that. So that's kind of why I started working on the community.
Yeah.
And then one of the other things you were talking about is the boundaries. And I've found, not just in podcast editing, but basically across the board. If you're doing anything that is looked at as freelance work or where you do the work from home, people tend to not understand boundaries the way they would if you worked in a brick and mortar office where they accept that you have business hours. So that's one thing I see a lot of people kind of struggling with is setting those boundaries of these are my business hours. You can't text me all day and night. All of those things, being able to set those boundaries so that the client understands when you will get back to them. Like you were saying, I might not get back to you until this time, but just setting the expectations that I'm not available to you 24/7.
Weirdly, I feel like the pandemic has helped with that somewhat, right? When literally everybody went from working in an office to working at home, it's become a little bit more normal. So I don't appreciate the pandemic at all. It's devastating, but that is one little, I think, golden nugget from the whole experience that I think um, has really turned things around for how we both interact with a, you know, quote unquote more traditional employer as well as with you know, like contract and freelance folks who are providing services.
So I want to talk about what are some of the struggles you face in trying to balance the freelance work with a regular traditional job.
And this is maybe a little bit of an ironic challenge to have because uh, you know, we were in podcasting, right? It's all about communication, but the communication struggle is very real when it comes to building that balance. Um, right? Because I think I mentioned at the very beginning that um, I had been a new parent when my friend and co-host and I started talking about a podcast. Um, but I do have 3 children, like my spouse and I do. Um, and so some of it is, right, like talking to the kids, right? Like, hey, you guys, when it's bedtime, you have got to stay in bed because, right, like I'm working on something or right, like I might be, you know, either I'm editing something or I'm a guest on a show. Like, when it's bedtime, it's bedtime. And here's why. um, and then like with my spouse, right, like um he also does something on the side, and so then we're going, okay, like we're being very thoughtful about when we're spending time together, and it's a lot of trial and error, I think, to get into a flow that works well for you. uh right, like maybe you are like me, a grudging early riser. I don't like waking up early. My body wakes me up anyway. um and so then I have kind of adopted that into, right, like my practice, right? Like I'm gonna do some work before everybody else wakes up. Um, and then kind of within that regular work day, I'm very lucky to work in an environment where if it's slow, because it is for all of us, regardless of your job, right? Like there are slow seasons and busy seasons. Um, then I'll be taking advantage of that to maybe, right, like that's when I would write the show notes, or I'm replying to an email that has a question that I can answer really quickly. Um, so it really is a lot of testing, right? Like what is going to work out for me really well, and be open to adapting that because your life changes and you need to change with it.
I think this is
Yeah.
a good opportunity to talk about the project that you're working on.
I'm launching a quarterly magazine. It's not a podcast. It is a magazine about podcasting. um, I think as I've been talking to folks, like that's been really difficult for people to wrap their heads around that you could also write about podcasting. You don't just have to talk about it. Um, so sound sorceresses, and I'm sorry if you don't like S's, but also not super sorry, is a quarterly magazine featuring up to 10 women, and it's women very specifically, who are writing about kind of a wide variety of things in podcasting. Um, Either discussing like kind of a technical skill set. So our first edition is coming out on October 1st. We have an article about Hindenburg, um, the which is one of the DAWs that is, at least amongst the people that I know, is extremely popular. I know a lot of people who use Hindenburg, so talking about that. But there's also kind of this narrative piece to it, right? Like women talking about their experiences in podcasting, or kind of a mix of the two, right? Like I had this experience out in the field, and here was the technical fix for my challenge. So that's kind of what you can expect from it, but it really was born out of, honestly, myself and a lot of other women basically just existing as people out there in the world as podcast editors. And there are a lot of articles talking about podcast editing and the technical pieces and building your business. But you might notice that a lot of those articles are quoting men. Men are great. Men are wonderful. They're only part of the gender soup that we all live in. And so there was a little group of us. Stefuccio of Coffee Like Media, Bethany Sands of Bethany Sands Audio was also, we kind of just started making these comments like, how, this is a great article. It's really too bad that you didn't quote any women in the article. And we kept hearing back from the authors, oh, there's just no women out there. And we're going, hey, women right here working in the field. And for me, it very much got to the point where I was like, okay, I've got to do something about this. This is very frustrating, right? There's a lot of women and non-binary folks who are working in podcasting. What can I do? And so a magazine was really where I landed. Now, the reason for the quarterly actually goes back to kind of that balance that we were talking about a minute ago. Right? If you've been listening, now you know. I'm a full-time worker with 3 children and a spouse. So I'm going, okay, I have this idea. I'm very excited about the idea. I've got a lot of other demands on my time. What's the release model that already makes sense for the life that I'm living right now? Because you can't just throw it all out. So that's why it's a quarterly publication. So the magazine is actually hosted on Substack, soundsorceresses.substack.com. You'll find all of our content there. We're releasing a bi-monthly newsletter to just kind of like build some excitement and help people to get to know our authors. But that's where you're going to go for like the subscription that I mentioned earlier, any other support options, or if you just want to read the newsletter or the magazine, it's all there on Substack.
I know when you first kind of announced this, you were talking about getting sponsors. Have you had any luck on that front?
So yeah, if you would like to sponsor Sound Sorceresses, I would love that. We have none right now. The other thing that we are doing, I say both to build community and that money piece of it, we are running a contest right now. Also subscribe to Sound Sorceresses. It's completely free. Like, you don't it's not behind a paywall or anything like that, just if it supporting women in audio storytelling is important to you. Um, one way that you can show that is by subscribing. If you sign up for a free subscription, which you totally can do, you get 1 free entry into this giveaway. If it's a paid subscription, you get 4 entries. So we're giving away the MV7 SRH440A tripod bundle that has the headphones and the microphone from Shure. So we're really excited that they were willing to partner with us. And it's just the product, but that has been really exciting to me as well. But
Well, I hope you find some because there needs to be more awareness that this is not only a male space. And I know
right,
I've talked with Allison Holly about this quite a bit because for me as a man, I feel frustrated because I've actually talked to more non-men on a technical detail in the podcast editing space than I have men. So there isn't a shortage of you out there. Like you said, Steph Fuccio has has a huge number of non-male editors that she would bring on to her different shows. So
yeah,
there really is no excuse for not including them in these bigger articles.
right, right. Well, and I think it's also so much, of course, like my focus is on women because that's like the space that I inhabit as a human being that lives in our society. But um, podcasting really is I would say it's male coded, but it's also um, I would also say that it's white coded and heterosexual coded, right? So we're really talking. So like when you're in the industry, right? Like there's this very thin veneer of hey, when we're talking about podcasting, we're talking about white straight guys. Um, and that is absolutely not the case, right? Um, and so I'm really as excited as I am about this project, and I hope that it really takes off and provides kind of like that representative and community space. The other thing that I hope that it does is to encourage people to do something similar representing their own community that they live in and inhabit. Um, right? Like I think that we need more. I don't even want to say more content, because there's a lot of content out there in the world. Uh, I think we need more spaces though for people to say, "Hey, uh, I'm a Black queer man, and this is how I'm experiencing the industry," and like building that kind of community, so that we can kind of shift that away from, uh, right, like this kind of dog whistle type coding to what I like. Maybe this just sounds naive, but I really do believe that like this and hopefully a bunch of other things really have the opportunity to make it clear how much podcasting is a medium for everybody to share their story and to be heard and valued, for that experience, for the experience that they have and the experience that they bring.
And I think, kind of along with what you're saying, it really helps to see that there, whoever you are, that there's other people like you in this space. To know that podcast editing isn't only a male driven space. And we need to, I mean, your magazine is going to help showcase that. And I know there's various female podcast groups out there or editors groups. So there are some, but so many of them are kind of only known by people who are of that specific group. And I
Right.
think we need something that's more open to share with the entire podcasting world that, hey, there's more people here, there's more diverse voices and backgrounds here than just white men.
A lot of women's groups that I'm in uh, are also somewhat critical because the way for right, like me to authentically run a business in the way that I show up in the world is completely different from a straight white guy, right? And there, I personally have experienced a lot of shame because I'm not building my business um, in a very aggressive fashion. And so I think that there's some of that too, that like we also need spaces that are encouraging people to be their authentic selves, right? You don't need to do things how somebody else would do them. You have to do them the way that you would do them.
And that's kind of the ethos around the community that I'm building. We're not telling people how to run a business the way that I run it, because the way I run it is going to be different than how you need to run your business. And it's going to be
Right.
different from how the next person needs to run their business. Like you were saying, it comes back to finding what works for you. You have to, if you
Yes.
don't like aggressive, hard sales tactics, why would you try to implement that into your business practice? And so it's about finding the the ways that are going to allow you to be successful in your own business. And that's what we try to help people with.
I want to ask you, how do people join your community? Because I love it. I love being there.
I have it's called tansyasteracademy.com, and we've got three different spaces there. We have podcast editing school, which as the name implies, it's all about podcast editing. My editing course lives there, and all of this is community powered. So, and what I found when creating the course was it it just offered one specific view of things. It it didn't allow people to ask questions, get clarifications, or get help with the audio that they're working on. So that's why I kind of started building the community to offer that aspect. And as I was building that out, I realized, hey, I have a wife who does branding and business stuff, and I have a sister who runs businesses and productions for all kinds of different things, from documentaries to political debates to rocket launches. So between the three of us, we can offer a lot of insight into and various viewpoints into helping people find their way of running their business. And we incorporated that into what we call the pro group, kind of aimed at people who run podcast services businesses. And then we have just kind of a community pass, which gives you some basic access to the community, but it doesn't have the more in depth stuff of the pro group or like all of the video archives, all of the video tutorials that we're creating. So we have three different options for people to choose from.
Gosh, I love that you guys are approaching it that way. I just think that's really cool.
Because again, like everything else we do, we looked at what's out there, and I didn't see a lot of stuff going in depth into how do I do this in RX. It's more
Right.
kind of superficial. This is how you do basic things in RX. And I wanted to go deeper into things to help people learn. And the same thing with the business. I wanted to find a way to help people find their way in the business world as opposed to just telling them how to do it the way that I'm doing it. Because, like we said earlier, the way I'm doing things probably isn't going to fit for how you want to do things. So we try to
Right.
teach kind of concepts and techniques rather than you do this, then you do this and this. Something really regimented or prescribed.
Right. That's, I don't know. I guess as far as I'm concerned, that's no kind of a way to approach anything. Right, because we are all so unique in how we perceive things and how we process things, and how we need to fit things into our lives. I think that's really
And
cool.
I think it might be a little bit easier for me to kind of see it that way because being neurodiverse, being on the autism spectrum, I've spent my whole life trying to make sense of everything else out there in the world, trying to make sense of why people do what they do. So it helps me see things probably from a different perspective than a neurotypical would.
I think that that's also a lot of uh, why so many of us are going, why are you like being so aggressive about, right, like this, that, or the other thing? Because I have not ever been diagnosed with anything, but one of my children is autistic. And it turns out there's a real strong genetic component to neurodiversity. So there's something going on there in the mental soup where, like, I also feel like I perceive things differently than a lot of my peers, which I think is also why these types of communities that allow people to like be authentic is so important. So there's, I think, a lot more neurodiverse people out there than um, some would care to admit.
I want to say about half of the people in the beta test for my community all mentioned being neurodiverse. So, yeah, there are a lot of us out there. And I think that's why maybe a lot of us don't feel like we fit in with the different groups out there because it does feel like they are very neurotypical driven
Yes,
and not as accepting of different viewpoints.
right. And it's funny to me, like with my daughter, we do all this work on like flexible thinking and like adjusting to changes in routine. And I'm like, should everybody be doing this kind of labor in flexible thinking? Because I know a lot of neurotypical people that would really benefit from that.
Like I'd said earlier, that's why I think I never felt like I fit in with the different groups that I'm in. There just does seem to be this very prescriptive way of this is the way it needs to be done, instead of acknowledging there are different ways things can be done. And that applies to the workplace. Not everybody does well with written instruction. Maybe they do better with oral instruction or seeing something done. It's when we're in the workplace, we really should be working with the individual to find out how we can work with them to help them succeed. And that's what I try to bring into the academy is to bring that perspective of not assuming everybody learns the same way and needs the same kind of instruction and working with the individual to try to find ways of helping them that's going to really resonate with them.
Right. It's so important. Or even, I think that like as a self-diagnosed neurodiverse person, something that I do is, like if I'm showing somebody how to do something, I'll say, here's how I'm approaching it, and here's why I'm approaching it in this way. Um, so then the person that I'm teaching will go, oh, okay, I understand why Rachel is approaching this task in a specific way. And now that I know that, I'm going to take a different route to get there in a way that makes sense for how I work. Um, and I don't think it's quote unquote normal for neurotypical people to think about why they're doing things in a certain way. It's just the way that it's done. And that's not very helpful.
It's helpful if you already know why it's being done that way, but for someone who's learning something new, no, understanding the reason why we're doing this is just as important as how to do it.
Exactly.
It's like we can teach people how to edit a podcast, but do they really understand why we're editing it? All of the kind of minute reasons behind it? Or are they just thinking, we edit because that's what I'm told I'm supposed to do?
Right. Right. There really is a kind of a linguistic understanding there too, right? Of uh, if you're having a face-to-face conversation with somebody, a long pause is totally fine. If you're listening to something in your earbuds while you're mowing the lawn or whatever, you're going to think that something happened to your device.
Yeah, I've had clients give me notes when I'm working with them for the first couple times, give me notes along the lines of, this pause here is too short. Make this pause 3 seconds longer. I'm like, 3 seconds,
That is going to feel like an eternity.
3 seconds is much longer than we think when we are sitting there listening to dead air.
Yes, it is.
And these numbers are just arbitrarily decided upon. So I just go back to the client and ask, 3 seconds seems rather specific. What are we trying to accomplish here? So if they come back and say, well, just I don't like how short the pause was. I want there to be a bigger break here between these two sections. Okay, I know how to work with that. I can extend that pause to a point where it feels natural but doesn't feel overly long.
Right. Right. Well, and it depends so much on the content of the podcast as well. Right. Um, I had an opportunity somewhat recently to work on a few episodes of Harper's podcast for Harper's Magazine. And they did an episode, they were interviewing one of their journalists who, and this was a new phrase for me, he wrote an article uh, for Harper's on the personal submersibles community. So, like ultra wealthy people who build their own submarines to dive to deep depths. Um, they were interviewing him on the podcast after, and now I don't remember the name of the submarine, but there was that terrible tragedy. A bunch of billionaires went down in a submarine and were crushed, unfortunately. Uh, so she was interviewing him about, hey, like, how are you feeling after you wrote this article as part of your due diligence as a journalist? You also went down in a vessel like the one that had the mechanical challenges. How does that feel to you? I left a lot longer pauses in that show than I would if you were just having a conversation about cryptic puzzles. There are not a lot of pauses in the cryptic puzzles episode, but when you're talking about like a tragedy, yep, there's going to be some long pauses because you're dealing with difficult content that's hard for people to process and think about and talk about.
Exactly. And one of the other clients I worked with more recently, they wanted a longer pause at the end of the episode. They wanted it extended 1 second. And it was already close to that. And I asked, what's the thinking behind extending this any further? Because I feel if I go further, it's going to feel unnaturally long. And she said
Yeah.
that she wanted the listeners to just take a second to think about what just happened. And I my advice was, if the listener doesn't know that that's why there's this unnaturally long pause, they're just going to think it sounds awkward. They don't know that that's there because you want
Right.
them to take a minute to reflect on what was just said. So if you want to set aside time for that, let's give them some kind of audio cue that you want them to
Yes.
do that, because the listener doesn't know what we're thinking when we put together the episode. So,
Right.
and that's something I think a lot of people don't think about. And I've run into this with neurotypicals. They think that because they know something, everybody knows it.
Right.
And sometimes they don't. So when we communicate in ways where we don't offer all of the information needed, people are kind of left wondering, why was there such a long pause here? Don't they know what they're doing?
Right. Well, I mean, it really is right, like, your average podcast listener is not going to think about the production that goes into the show, and that's how you want it, right? You don't want them going, "Do they need to hire a new producer for that show?" Right? It should just be not a thought at all.
If we've done our job well, nobody should be thinking about anything but the content. As soon as their mind wanders from the content to the production, we haven't done our job as well as we could have.